Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also curious, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? Now settle in, get comfortable, let the world slow down. In the quiet lakeside city of Northbrook, Ohio, there lived a little girl named Eliana Rose Carter. She was 4 years old when the adults around her began missing what she was trying to tell them. Eliana had been born on a cool September morning, the first and only child of Marissa Carter and Daniel Rose. Her parents' relationship ended early, before Eliana could form memories of them together. By the time she was 2, court documents finalized a custody arrangement that granted Marissa full custody, while Daniel was allowed scheduled visitation. Friends of the family remembered Eliana as expressive and bright. She liked to hum while playing, often spinning in small circles as if music followed her everywhere. Her favorite color was lavender, and she insisted on wearing mismatched socks, because, in her words, they're happier that way. But as Eliana grew, so did the tension around her. Daniel began noticing things during his limited visits. Small marks, bruises that didn't match the explanations given. When he asked, Marissa brushed it off as clumsiness, playground tumbles, or normal childhood mishaps. At first, he wanted to believe her. No parent wants to assume the worst. Over time, though, the unease settled in. By early 2017, Daniel had documented several instances where Eliana appeared withdrawn during visits. She was quieter. She startled easily. When he tried to hug her goodbye, she stiffened instead of leaning in. Once, when he lifted her shirt to help her change, he noticed fading discoloration on her back. When he asked gently what happened, Eliana shrugged and said, "I fell." Daniel reported his concerns to court family, but the response was slow. Marissa countered by filing complaints of harassment, claiming Daniel was disruptive and overstepping boundaries. Within weeks, a temporary restraining order limited his direct contact with her, and his visits with Eliana were restricted to monitored settings. That decision would echo through everything that followed. Around the same time, Eliana was enrolled at Bright Horizons Learning Center, a licensed daycare in Northbrook. At first, staff described her as shy but polite. She followed instructions. She rarely cried. She seemed eager to please. Within weeks, caregivers began noticing injuries. A scratch on her cheek one day, redness on her arms another, a bruise on her collarbone that drew quiet concern during morning check-in. Staff followed protocol. They documented what they saw. They asked Marissa about it. Marissa's explanations varied. Allergic reactions, accidental falls, rough play. One caregiver later recalled something that stayed with her. Eliana once flinched when an adult raised their voice across the room. It wasn't directed at her. Still, she froze. Over the next few months, 17 separate incident notes were logged by the daycare. Each was reported internally. Some were escalated to supervisors. A few were forwarded to child services. Nothing changed. In May, Eliana arrived with swelling near her hairline and a scrape above her eyebrow. When asked what happened, she quietly said, "I fell down the stairs." Later that same day, when another caregiver asked again, Eliana hesitated and added, "Mom was mad." That statement was reported. Marissa insisted the child was confused and prone to exaggeration. No immediate action followed. A few days later, Eliana complained of head pain. Staff noticed irritation on her scalp and dried blood near her ear. Marissa blamed a reaction to soap, then tight braids, then said she wasn't sure. When a supervisor asked Eliana privately what happened, the child said something that would later appear in official reports. "Mom hit me. I was bad." The daycare contacted authorities. Eliana was taken for medical evaluation. After several hours, she was released back into Marissa's care. Daniel was notified. He requested emergency custody. His request was denied. By summer, Marissa had begun dating Terrence Miles, a 27-year-old security guard. To those outside the home, he appeared quiet and reserved. Family members later described him as controlling and distant. After Terrence moved in, communication with extended family stopped almost entirely. Visits with Daniel became more difficult to schedule. When they did happen, Eliana appeared thinner. Her lively chatter faded into one-word answers. Daniel noticed her struggling to climb onto a chair during a supervised visit. He also noticed a tooth that appeared discolored and untreated. He took photos. He filed reports. Again. In December, an emergency referral was finally made to Lake County Child Services. A caseworker visited the apartment. She observed bruising. She noted concerns, but she also checked boxes. The utilities worked. There was food in the cabinets. The home met minimum standards. The case remained open briefly, then stalled. Shortly after, Marissa transferred Eliana to a new preschool called Little Steps Academy, where Marissa herself worked as an assistant teacher. This decision significantly reduced outside oversight. Teachers noticed Eliana's weight loss. Her posture was slumped. She no longer participated in group activities. When colleagues raised concerns, Marissa dismissed them. She's always been small. By January, law enforcement formally closed their investigation into Marissa. The case was marked unsubstantiated. No one informed Daniel until weeks later. Inside the apartment, Eliana's world continued to shrink. She stopped running. Then she stopped standing for long periods. Family members later recalled a visit where she remained lying on a bed, barely responding. When asked if she was okay, Marissa said, "She's tired." No one called for help. In early March, a follow-up welfare visit was scheduled. Marissa postponed it. On March 11th, Terrence called emergency services, claiming Eliana had fallen in the bathroom and wasn't breathing properly. When the call was transferred to Marissa, she said she didn't feel air when she checked her daughter's breathing. Instructions were given. They were not followed. When first responders arrived, they noticed the apartment was unusually cold. A strong chemical smell lingered. Eliana was found dressed in layers, lying still on the floor. She was already gone. What investigators would later uncover would reveal not a sudden accident, but a long chain of ignored warnings, dismissed voices, and institutional failure. And it all began with a child who tried, again and again, to speak. The apartment on East Willow Drive was sealed within hours of Eliana Carter's death. What had once appeared to be an ordinary two-bedroom unit now became the center of a widening investigation, one that would soon expose how long the danger had existed and how many chances there had been to stop it. First responders had already sensed that something was deeply wrong. The temperature inside the apartment was noticeably low, despite the early spring chill outside. Windows were closed. An air conditioning unit was running continuously. Officers would later note that the cold felt deliberate, not accidental. Eliana was not found near the bathroom where the fall had supposedly occurred. Instead, she lay in the living room, dressed in winter clothing despite the indoor conditions. There were no signs of a recent fall consistent with the story provided by Marissa Carter and Terrence Miles. Rigor mortis had already set in. That detail alone contradicted the timeline given during the emergency call. Investigators began documenting the scene carefully. The mattress in Eliana's bedroom had no fitted sheet or comforter, only a thin blanket that smelled strongly of urine. Cleaning supplies were visible throughout the apartment. Torn paperwork sat in the kitchen trash, including fragments of court documents related to Daniel Rose's custody filings. Food in the home was scarce: a nearly empty refrigerator, dry pantry shelves, 2 partially eaten takeout containers sat cold in the microwave. As detectives worked through the apartment, the case shifted from possible accident to suspected homicide. Marissa and Terrence were separated and transported to the police station for questioning. During her interview, Marissa appeared calm. She spoke slowly, often pausing before answering. She claimed Eliana had become sick several days earlier after eating at a restaurant. According to her, Eliana had vomited and refused food. Marissa said she believed her daughter was exaggerating to avoid discipline. At one point, she suggested that Eliana had worked herself up and frightened herself into medical distress. Terrence's statement differed in subtle but important ways. He described Eliana as weak and quiet in the days leading up to her death. He admitted she had been unable to stand without assistance. When asked why medical care had not been sought, he said Marissa insisted the child was pretending. Both adults denied causing harm. Both minimized the child's condition. Neither could explain the extent of her physical decline. The autopsy would. Conducted by Dr. Elaine Morton, a senior forensic pathologist for Lake County, the examination painted a devastating timeline of neglect and injury. Eliana weighed 26 pounds at the time of her death, placing her far below healthy standards for her age. Her body showed clear signs of prolonged malnutrition. Internally, Dr. Morton identified a subdural hematoma, an injury caused by blunt force trauma to the head that had developed over weeks, not hours. The damage had led to a cerebral infarction, effectively a stroke, impairing movement and function. This explained witness accounts from family members who recalled Eliana being unable to walk weeks earlier. The medical findings confirmed what reports had long suggested. Eliana had not died suddenly. She had been deteriorating slowly, visibly, and painfully. The cause of death was ruled cerebral infarction due to blunt force trauma, with severe malnutrition as a contributing factor. The manner of death was classified as homicide. As investigators reviewed Eliana's medical history, daycare reports, and child services records, the full scope of institutional failure came into focus. Bright Horizons Learning Center had filed numerous injury reports. Staff had followed protocol. They had spoken up. They had documented Eliana's statements verbatim. Child services had been notified more than once. Yet communication between agencies had been fragmented. Caseworkers failed to compare notes. Medical findings were not cross-referenced with prior reports. Supervisors closed cases prematurely based on housing conditions rather than the child's physical state. One particularly troubling discovery came from reviewing police records. Weeks before Eliana's death, Marissa had contacted authorities to report a stolen laptop. Officers responded to the apartment. They spoke briefly with Terrence at the door. They never went inside. Had they done so, investigators later concluded, Eliana would likely have been found alive but critically ill. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses added another layer. On the night before Eliana's death, Marissa and Terrence were recorded eating at a fast casual restaurant. Later, they were seen shopping at a large retail store, purchasing household items, including cleaning products. Their child was alone at home. As the evidence mounted, the charges followed. Both Marissa Carter and Terrence Miles were arrested and charged with murder, aggravated murder, child endangerment, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. The case shocked the Northbrook community. As news spread, attention turned to Daniel Rose. For years, he had warned authorities, he had filed petitions, he had documented injuries, he had pleaded with courts and agencies to intervene. Each time he was told there was not enough evidence. Now he sat in a courtroom, preparing to testify about the daughter he had tried to save. The trial began nearly a year later. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case, supported by medical science, witness testimony, and paper trails that stretched back years. They presented daycare logs, hospital records, social service notes, and surveillance footage. 36 witnesses testified, including daycare staff, paramedics, doctors, family members, and investigators. When graphic evidence was shown, Marissa remained largely expressionless. Prosecutors argued that her detachment was not shock, but indifference. Terrence's defense attempted to shift blame, suggesting Marissa was solely responsible for caregiving decisions. Marissa's defense suggested medical complications and accidents. Neither explanation survived scrutiny. Dr. Morton's testimony was particularly impactful. She explained in clear but clinical terms how Eliana's injuries developed over time, how the brain damage impaired her ability to eat, move, and communicate, how starvation compounded the trauma. Most importantly, she emphasized that Eliana's condition would have been obvious to any attentive adult. Daniel's testimony brought the courtroom to silence. He described the last supervised visit he had with his daughter, how she clung to him, how thin she felt in his arms, how her eyes seemed tired in a way no 4-year-olds should be. He spoke about the restraining order that kept him away, about the reports that went unanswered, about the system that told him to wait. The jury deliberated for days. When the verdict was read, both defendants were found guilty on all counts. Marissa Carter was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Terrence Miles received life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The judge described their actions as sustained cruelty through neglect and violence, emphasizing that Eliana's death was preventable at multiple points. But the trial did not end the story. In the months that followed, Daniel Rose filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Lake County Child Services. The suit alleged gross negligence, failure to follow protocol, and systemic breakdowns that allowed repeated warnings to be ignored. An independent investigation was launched. Internal emails, disciplinary records, and policy violations came to light. Caseworkers had failed to follow up. Supervisors had closed files without adequate review. Reports from childcare professionals had not been escalated properly. Several employees were disciplined, others were terminated. Policy reforms were announced, new training requirements, mandatory cross-agency communication, stricter oversight of repeat injury reports. Too late for Eliana. Her funeral was held over 2 days. The small casket, painted in soft lavender, was carried through the streets of Northbrook. Community members lined the sidewalks in silence. Daniel spoke briefly. "She tried to tell us," he said, "and we didn't listen." Eliana's name would later be cited in policy discussions and reform proposals. Her case became a reference point, a warning. But for those who knew her, she would always be the little girl who loved music, mismatched socks, and lavender, and who tried again and again to be heard. The convictions of Marissa Carter and Terrence Miles were supposed to bring closure. In a legal sense, they did. The courtroom doors closed, the sentencing was complete, the defendants were led away in restraints. But outside the courthouse, few people felt relief. For many in Northbrook, Eliana's death had become something larger than a single case of abuse and neglect. It was a mirror held up to institutions designed to protect children, revealing gaps so wide that a 4-year-old could fall through unnoticed, even while asking for help. In the weeks following sentencing, attention shifted away from the defendants and toward the agencies that had been involved long before Eliana's final days. Daniel Rose did not attend the sentencing hearing in person. Instead, he sat at home, surrounded by boxes of documents he had kept for years, copies of injury photos, emails to social workers, court filings, notes he had written after supervised visits. Each page was a reminder of how loudly he had tried to sound the alarm. 3 months after the verdict, Daniel filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Lake County Child Services, the agency responsible for overseeing Eliana's welfare. The lawsuit alleged gross negligence, failure to follow mandatory reporting procedures, and systemic indifference toward repeated warning signs. The filing named no individual caseworker at first. Instead, it focused on policy failures, missed follow-ups, closed investigations that ignored medical evidence, a lack of communication between law enforcement, child care centers, and social services. As the lawsuit progressed, internal documents were subpoenaed. What emerged was deeply troubling. Case notes revealed that Eliana's file had been reassigned multiple times, often without a full review of prior reports. Injury documentation from daycare centers had been logged but not cross-referenced with hospital records. Supervisors had approved closures based largely on housing conditions rather than physical health indicators. One internal memo, written months before Eliana's death, referenced no immediate safety threat despite noting visible bruising and weight loss. Another revealed that a scheduled follow-up visit had been postponed at the caregiver's request with no urgency attached. The independent review commissioned by the county confirmed what many feared. The system had not failed once, it had failed repeatedly. The report identified a pattern of minimized concerns, procedural shortcuts, and inadequate oversight. It cited insufficient training in recognizing chronic abuse indicators and a lack of accountability when protocols were not followed. Several employees received formal reprimands, 2 supervisors were terminated, mandatory retraining programs were announced, public apologies were issued. For Daniel, none of it felt sufficient. In interviews, he spoke not with anger, but with exhaustion. He described the helplessness of watching institutions reassure him while his daughter's condition visibly worsened. He recalled moments when he considered breaking court orders just to remove her himself. He was told to trust the process, he said. I did, and it killed her. Community response grew rapidly. Candlelight vigils were held outside the courthouse and at Eliana's former daycare. Parents attended, holding their children close. Child advocates spoke about the dangers of assuming silence meant safety. Local lawmakers introduced a reform bill informally referred to as Eliana's Law. The proposal required automatic escalation when multiple injury reports were filed across different institutions. It mandated in-person home inspections for any child reporting abuse directly, regardless of caregiver explanation. It also restricted the closure of investigations based solely on environmental conditions. The bill passed committee review within months. At the same time, Lake County Child Services underwent restructuring. New leadership was appointed, caseworker caseloads were reduced, and a centralized reporting database was created to prevent information from being siloed. On paper, progress was happening, but Eliana remained absent. Daniel visited her grave weekly. He spoke to her aloud, telling her about the changes being made in her name. He told her about the stuffed animals left by strangers, about letters from parents who said her story saved their own children. In private, he admitted that none of it erased the guilt he carried. I should have done more, he said, despite years of evidence that he had done everything legally possible. In 2022, Terrence Miles filed an appeal arguing that his trial had been unfair and responsibility had been misassigned. The appellate court reviewed the record, including medical testimony and surveillance evidence. The appeal was denied. The court affirmed that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conviction. Marissa Carter did not appeal. In prison, she declined interviews. Psychological evaluations described her as emotionally detached, with limited insight into her actions. No public statements of remorse were issued. As years passed, Eliana's name became part of training materials for social workers statewide. Her case was referenced in seminars on child advocacy, mandatory reporting, and investigative diligence. But beyond policy and paperwork, her story lived on in quieter ways. A mural was painted near Bright Horizons Learning Center, depicting a small figure surrounded by stars. A scholarship fund was created in her name, supporting early childhood education. Every March, Daniel organized a community walk for child abuse awareness. Attendance grew each year. During the 5th anniversary, he spoke briefly at the podium. "Eliana taught us something," he said. "Not just about cruelty, about listening, about believing children when they speak." He paused before continuing. "She told the truth over and over again." Those words echoed the most haunting element of the case. Eliana had not been silent. She told daycare workers, she told her father, she told medical staff, she pointed to her injuries, she named the people who hurt her. Her voice had been clear. What failed was not her ability to speak, but the willingness of adults and institutions to act decisively. Experts reviewing the case later emphasized a painful truth. Children rarely fabricate abuse claims. When they speak, especially repeatedly, they are usually telling the truth as they understand it. Eliana understood enough. In the final analysis, her story exposed a dangerous misconception: that systems, once alerted, automatically protect, that paperwork equates to action, that procedures ensure safety. They do not. Protection requires urgency, accountability, and the courage to disrupt comfort in the face of inconvenience. Eliana's death forced those lessons into the open. Her life, though short, reshaped policies, conversations, and awareness across an entire region. That impact did not come from tragedy alone, but from persistence, from a child who refused to stop telling the truth even when no one listened, and from a father who never stopped trying to be heard. Eliana Carter's story is not just about what happened behind closed doors. It is about what happened in offices, meeting rooms, and court filings, about how easily warning signs can be rationalized away. It is a reminder that justice does not begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment someone chooses to take a child seriously. And sometimes that choice is the difference between life and silence. Maya Rudd entered the world just before dawn on October 12, 2023, in Owensboro, Kentucky. The early morning air was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually signals a beginning filled with hope. She was the 4th child born to Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd, and from the outside, her arrival looked like nothing more than another newborn joining a growing family. Inside the Tucker Rudd household, Maya quickly earned a nickname. Her family called her Smiley, a name inspired by the toothless grin that seemed permanently etched on her face. Even as a newborn, she smiled easily. It was the kind of smile that made people pause, the kind that softened voices and drew attention without effort. To anyone who saw her, Maya looked like a baby wrapped in innocence and possibility. Her siblings were immediately drawn to her. The oldest was already school-aged, old enough to understand responsibility. The middle two were still toddlers, barely able to grasp what it meant to have a new sister. Maya bonded most closely with her brother, just over a year older than her. He had a way of making her laugh that no one else did. By 8 months old, Maya was learning to sit up, rocking slightly as she tested her balance, almost ready to crawl. She was developing right on schedule. Physically, she stood out. Soft brown hair, bright green eyes, tiny toes that curled when she was happy. Family members later described her as alert, expressive, and unusually responsive for her age. She watched faces closely. She reacted to voices. She smiled often. In a different home, those traits might have been celebrated without hesitation. But while Maya's life appeared normal on the surface, the foundation beneath her was deeply unstable. Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd had been married since January 2015. Over the years, they built a reputation in their rural Kentucky community that was anything but positive. They lived in Reynolds Station, an unincorporated area roughly 25 miles from Owensboro. It was quiet, spread out, and largely ignored by outsiders. That isolation would later matter. Neighbors described Tesla and Cage as volatile and careless. They were known for reckless driving on narrow local roads. Some claimed property thefts went unresolved. Others said they avoided the family entirely. Trust was thin, and concern quietly grew. Their legal history only added to that concern. Cage Rudd had prior felony convictions related to drug possession and distribution. In March 2024, he pleaded guilty to drug-related charges and was placed under supervised diversion instead of serving prison time. His father, Ricky Smith, was also a convicted felon with a long-standing history of drug offenses and parole violations. On Tesla's father's side of the family, the picture was no better. Her mother, Taliva Tucker, had theft and check fraud charges in Indiana that she avoided by failing to appear in court. Tesla's father, David Tucker, carried unpaid court fines that lingered unresolved for years. The pattern was unmistakable. Legal consequences were delayed, avoided, or ignored entirely. Accountability never stuck. Just weeks after Maya was born, a violent incident involving her paternal grandmother added another layer of instability. In October 2023, Billy Smith was involved in a serious assault outside the home of a man who claimed to have been in a relationship with her for months. According to his statement, the confrontation turned physical when Billy demanded money and access to his truck. When he refused, the situation escalated. He reported being struck repeatedly until he lost consciousness. Billy later told police she acted in self-defense, claiming the man threatened her with a wooden bat. She was not arrested at the scene, but would later have an arrest warrant issued for second-degree assault. Once again, consequences were postponed. By this point, Maya's family tree was riddled with criminal charges, violence, substance abuse, and unresolved legal trouble. Still, Maya remained in her parents' care. That decision would soon prove fatal. Not long after Maya's birth, Child Protective Services began paying close attention to the Tucker-Rudd household. The trigger was immediate and alarming. Maya's umbilical cord tested positive for methamphetamines. That result alone placed her in a high-risk category. Social services initiated the process to remove Maya from her parents' custody. On paper, the system worked as intended. Reports were filed, caseworkers attempted contact, home visits were scheduled. In practice, everything stalled. Calls were unanswered, visits to the Reynolds Station home led nowhere. Tesla and Cage were rarely present. When they were, they refused to cooperate. Extended family members were contacted, but none stepped forward in a meaningful way. Some claimed they could not help, others simply would not. Meanwhile, Maya's 3 older siblings had already been removed from the home at different times due to unsafe living conditions. They were placed with maternal grandparents, but Maya stayed behind. She was smaller, younger, easier to overlook. As weeks turned to months, the situation inside the Reynolds Station home grew worse. In late 2023, a man named Brody Payne moved onto the property. He lived in a trailer with its vehicle identification number removed, a red flag in itself. Ricky Smith was also living there, and this was no temporary arrangement. Together, the adults began operating a drug distribution setup directly from the home. Packages were shipped through the United States Postal Service, drugs were handled openly, weapons were present. Maya was there through it all. Social services continued trying to intervene, but without cooperation, progress was slow. Despite having the authority to request assistance from state police, that step was never taken. Later, law enforcement would confirm they were never asked to help locate or protect Maya during those early months. By the time the state intensified its crackdown on drug trafficking in mid-2024, Maya had already been exposed to an environment that no infant could survive safely. Kentucky State Police launched a statewide initiative called Operation Summer Heat, targeting drug networks across every county. Hundreds of arrests followed. Millions in contraband were seized. The operation made headlines and was credited with reducing overdose deaths statewide. The Reynolds Station operation did not go unnoticed for long. A detection dog alerted officers to a suspicious package addressed to Brody Payne. Inside was a significant amount of methamphetamines. Surveillance followed. Months of quiet investigation led officers straight back to the Reynolds Station home. When police arrived with the package, Brody stepped outside to retrieve it. He was arrested immediately. Additional packages containing counterfeit pills laced with fentanyl were seized. His charges were severe: trafficking, drug possession, organized criminal activity. But what law enforcement did not yet know was that an 8-month-old baby tied to that home had not been seen in weeks, and Maya Rudd was already missing. By the time Brody Payne was led away in handcuffs in late May of 2024, law enforcement believed they had dismantled yet another reckless drug operation. What they did not yet understand was that the most serious crime connected to the Reynolds Station property had nothing to do with trafficking at all. It involved a baby no one could find. Maya Rudd had last been seen by extended family sometime in April. No one could agree on the exact date. That alone was unusual. Infants do not simply fade into uncertainty. Someone always remembers the last feeding, the last outfit, the last sound. But with Maya, the timeline was already blurred. In early June, Tesla Tucker's sister Alexis received a troubling message. A family member told her that Child Protective Services had taken Maya away weeks earlier. The claim was delivered casually, almost offhand, as if it were common knowledge. Alexis felt something immediately was wrong. CPS removals left paperwork, phone calls, follow-ups. None of that had happened. She contacted law enforcement and asked for a welfare check on her 8-month-old niece. Officers went to the Reynolds Station home. No one answered. The house appeared quiet. No baby sounds, no movement. Calls to Tesla and Cage went unanswered. Investigators then spoke to Taliva Tucker, Maya's maternal grandmother. Taliva repeated the same story. She claimed Tesla told her CPS had taken Maya on May 1st. Detectives followed the lead. CPS records showed no such removal, no paperwork, no case closure, no placement. The story collapsed immediately. At first, police treated it as a missing child case complicated by drug arrests, but the more they examined the timeline, the darker it became. Brody Payne had been operating a drug distribution network out of a home where an infant was supposed to be living, and now that infant could not be located. On June 6th, law enforcement found Tesla Tucker, Cage Rudd, and Ricky Smith inside a Super 8 motel room. The room was registered in Cage's name. Inside, officers found what they described as a heavy presence of street drugs. Pills suspected to be laced with fentanyl sat within arm's reach. Methamphetamine was found in multiple locations. Drug paraphernalia was openly visible. All 3 adults were arrested. When questioned about Maya's whereabouts, every answer led nowhere. They claimed ignorance. They repeated the CPS story. They offered no proof, no documents, no names, no caseworkers. They spoke calmly, confidently, and falsely. Police charged them with child abandonment along with multiple drug offenses. They were booked into the same detention center where Brody Payne was already being held. The situation had escalated rapidly, but investigators were still hoping Maya was alive somewhere. That hope began to thin. Over the next several days, law enforcement widened the search. Officers combed the wooded areas surrounding the Reynolds Station home. They searched nearby properties, old sheds, and a cemetery located on a hill not far from the house. Cadaver dogs were brought in, not because police had given up hope, but because they could not afford to assume anything. The community noticed. Reynolds Station was not close-knit, but it was observant. People knew Tesla and Cage by reputation. They were not well liked, but what happened next shifted public opinion from distrust to outrage. Many residents had no idea a fourth child even existed in that home. When they learned an infant was missing, they joined the search. Volunteers walked tree lines, they shared flyers, they called in tips. For a brief moment, the entire area was unified by one goal: find the baby. On June 9th, detectives visited Billy Smith, Maya's paternal grandmother. Maya was not there. Billy was taken into custody anyway due to outstanding warrants from the previous year. During the same visit, officers arrested another man at the property, Timothy Roach, who attempted to hide prescription drugs under a vehicle. Both were booked into the Ohio County Detention Center. The arrests kept piling up, but Maya remained missing. The following day, Tesla, Cage, and Ricky appeared in court for arraignments related to the drug charges. They showed little emotion. None asked about their daughter. None asked about the search. Behind the scenes, investigators were becoming deeply concerned. On June 12th, police returned to Maya's maternal grandparents, David and Taliva Tucker, this time with a search warrant. Again, Maya was not there. Both grandparents were arrested for unrelated warrants and taken into custody. Their electronic devices were seized for analysis. Maya's 3 older siblings were immediately removed and placed in safe care. By this point, 8 adults connected to Maya's life had been arrested in less than 2 weeks. None had provided information that led investigators any closer to her location. Public statements from Kentucky State Police grew more serious. Officials emphasized that while they hoped Maya was alive, time was working against them. They acknowledged the role drug addiction played in the case, calling it a clear example of how deeply substance abuse could rot an entire family system. Behind closed doors, detectives were preparing for the worst. The Reynolds Station home had been searched before, but not thoroughly. The interior was considered dangerous due to chemical exposure from drug residue. Officers were concerned about overdosing simply by spending time inside. Multiple precautions had to be taken before a full search could be conducted. On June 14th, investigators returned. Inside the entryway of the home, they noticed a black Adidas duffel bag partially concealed beneath debris. It did not belong there. It was out of place. They opened it. Maya was inside. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition. She was unrecognizable at first glance. The search ended immediately. The house fell silent. A transport vehicle took her remains to the Louisville Regional Office of the medical examiner. The home was sealed again as investigators processed the scene. Drugs, weapons, and paraphernalia were found throughout the residence. One officer later reported finding drug residue dangerously close to Maya's crib. What investigators saw confirmed what they already suspected. The house had never been safe. Not for a baby, not for anyone. News of Maya's discovery spread quickly. The community that had hoped for a miracle now faced the reality they feared most. Vigils were held quietly. Anger followed grief. In total, 8 people had been arrested during the search for Maya. 4 of them, Tesla Tucker, Cage Rudd, and Ricky Smith, were formally charged in connection with her mistreatment and abandonment. The charges were not yet murder. The medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death due to decomposition, but the manner of death was ruled a homicide. Toxicology later revealed methamphetamine in Maya's system. Even in death, she carried evidence of the environment she had been forced to endure. Her funeral was held in late July. Family members spoke, music played. A small white casket carried the weight of a system that failed her repeatedly. The legal battle, however, was far from over. The charges would grow, the consequences would deepen, and Maya's name would soon become attached to something larger than tragedy. The days after Maya's discovery were a blur of legal motions, police reports, and grieving family members. Kentucky State Police worked tirelessly to build a case that would hold up in court. Maya's death had already been ruled a homicide, even if the exact cause of death could not be determined. The officers, detectives, and prosecutors knew that proving responsibility for her death would be complex, but they were determined. What they were certain of was that Maya had been placed in extreme danger by the very people charged with her protection: her parents, their accomplices, and the adults who had allowed her to remain in a home riddled with drugs, weapons, and violence. Tesla Tucker, Cage Rudd, Ricky Smith, and Brody Payne had all been initially charged with drug possession, trafficking, and firearms offenses. Those charges were severe, but they were now only a prelude to the gravity of what lay ahead. In the immediate weeks following the discovery of Maya's remains, prosecutors added charges related to child abandonment, endangerment, and criminal abuse. These charges were designed to reflect not just the presence of illegal drugs, but the conscious decision to allow a vulnerable infant to live in an environment where her survival was constantly at risk. Court appearances began in mid-June. Each adult appeared in the courtroom with their attorneys, their faces a mixture of indifference, fatigue, and in Tesla's case, moments of visible distress. When the charges were read aloud, Tesla cried. Her sobs echoed in the small courtroom, though witnesses later noted that Cage, Ricky, and Brody appeared unfazed. Their attorneys filed motions, requested continuances, and challenged the validity of the evidence. However, with 8 arrests, multiple witness statements, toxicology reports, and the medical examiner's findings, the prosecution had built a case that was difficult to refute. While the adults awaited trial, investigators turned their attention to the broader family network. Maya's maternal grandparents, Taliva and David Tucker, and paternal grandmother, Billy Smith, had also been arrested. Though they were not initially charged with murder or endangerment related directly to Maya, their inaction and the environment they enabled were noted. Some charges, such as failure to report a child in danger and obstructing justice, were filed against them, ensuring that no part of Maya's story would be ignored. The courtroom proceedings were long and detailed. Prosecutors painted a picture of systemic neglect and conscious disregard for an infant's safety. They described the home as a hazard: drug residue covering surfaces, weapons within reach, and the presence of multiple adults with criminal histories actively engaging in illegal activity. Witnesses spoke of repeated court orders that had been ignored. Social workers detailed their unsuccessful attempts to intervene. Toxicologists testified about the methamphetamine in Maya's system. Each piece of evidence painted a grim picture, one that made it impossible to see Maya's death as anything but a foreseeable outcome of her environment. By late 2024, 6 months after Maya's remains had been recovered, the Kentucky State Police presented new evidence that allowed the prosecution to escalate the charges. The 4 primary adults, Tesla, Cage, Ricky, and Brody, were now facing murder charges in addition to the original drug and endangerment counts. Prosecutors argued that while no one could identify the precise act that directly caused Maya's death due to decomposition, the combination of neglect, exposure to drugs, and disregard for her welfare constituted legal grounds for first-degree murder charges. The superseding indictment detailed the additional charges. Each adult faced 1 count of murder for Maya and 1 count of criminal abuse for each of Maya's 3 older siblings. Ricky Smith also faced persistent felony offender status, which compounded the penalties he would face if convicted. Tesla, Ricky, and Grody pleaded not guilty to the new murder charges in early February 2025. Cage's arraignment was delayed, but he too would face similar charges in court. Each defendant was held on $250,000 cash bonds. While the trial preparations unfolded, attention shifted to the systemic failures that had allowed Maya's death to occur. Investigations revealed mismanagement within the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services, CHFS. Reports showed that social workers had attempted multiple interventions, but the agency's processes had been slow, fragmented, and ineffective. They failed to utilize law enforcement resources, delayed follow-ups, and encountered uncooperative extended family members. The oversight issue became a public controversy. Allison Ball, the state auditor, highlighted that the CHFS had initially denied the Office of the Ombudsman access to a key database called ITWIST, which contained records of child welfare cases. This restriction had delayed investigations and limited the ability of the Ombudsman to intervene effectively. This legal battle underscored the importance of transparency and accountability in child protection systems. Beyond the courtroom, Maya's story ignited public outrage and spurred legislative action. A concerned citizen, Eric Williams, launched a petition on change.org advocating for new laws to protect newborns from parents with a history of child abuse or neglect. Within days, the petition garnered thousands of signatures. His core argument was simple. If parents had lost custody of previous children and had not demonstrated meaningful change, they should not automatically regain custody of a newborn. The petition captured the attention of Kentucky State Representative Myron Dossett, who sponsored House Bill 574, now colloquially known as Maya's Law. The bill aimed to create a legal safeguard for newborns by requiring that authorities be notified and intervene if a child was born to parents with ongoing cases of abuse or unresolved child protection issues. The language of the bill emphasized accountability and proactive prevention, ensuring that no infant would be left in an unsafe environment merely because the parents had the right to custody of a newborn by default. While the legislation moved through the House Standing Committee and onto the floor for debate, Maya's surviving siblings were placed in the care of their aunt, Alice, and her partner, John. Interviews with Alice revealed the profound impact of the tragedy on the family. She described the moment she learned Maya had been found, a mix of disbelief, horror, and grief. Despite the circumstances, Alice and John committed to raising Maya's 3 siblings, determined to provide them with the stability and care their parents had failed to offer. Their promise extended beyond basic care. They aimed to offer education, a sense of normalcy, and the kind of nurturing that had been absent in their early months. Their home became a haven, a stark contrast to the chaos of Reynolds Station. The community, once passive observers, now actively supported the family with donations, guidance, and emotional solidarity. Meanwhile, in court, the trial for Tesla, Cage, Ricky, and Brody moved forward. Testimonies were harrowing. Prosecutors presented a timeline of neglect, corroborated by social worker reports, drug trafficking records, witness statements, and toxicology evidence. Each piece illustrated a chain of preventable actions or failures to act that ultimately led to Maya's death. Tesla was convicted on 10 counts, including drug trafficking, child endangerment, and firearms possession. Cage, Ricky, and Brody were each convicted on 13 counts, with the additional charges reflecting repeated felonies and firearms violations. These convictions were significant, but they were only the beginning. The murder charges, the counts of abuse of Maya's 3 siblings, and the broader legal ramifications of the case were still pending trial, set to unfold in subsequent hearings. The legal outcomes were accompanied by a statewide reckoning. Child protection agencies began reviewing protocols, prioritizing collaboration with law enforcement, and ensuring that infants and toddlers were not left in hazardous conditions while paperwork and procedures lagged. Public trust in child welfare systems had been shaken, and the case served as a stark reminder that bureaucratic delays could cost lives. The passage of Maya's law marked a turning point. The bill codified a preventative approach that required authorities to intervene proactively in high-risk situations. By connecting prior custody cases to newborn protection, the legislation ensured that parents with histories of neglect could not inadvertently place a new child in harm's way. The law also provided clear reporting mechanisms for community members, social workers, and law enforcement, creating a safety net that was previously missing. Even as the system evolved, the human toll remained. Maya's funeral, held in July 2024, was a somber event, attended by family, friends, and concerned community members. The service was a reminder of what was lost and why the ensuing legal and legislative measures mattered so profoundly. Her 3 siblings, now safe, would carry the memory of her sister's life and death, guided by relatives who vowed never to allow a repeat of the past. Maya's case became a symbol of the consequences of neglect, substance abuse, and systemic failure. It underscored the urgency of proactive child protection and the dangers of ignoring warning signs, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. It also highlighted the power of community advocacy, legislative reform, and dedicated professionals willing to fight for justice, even in the face of bureaucratic obstacles. By the start of 2025, the legal proceedings had set the stage for the eventual sentencing of those responsible. While trials for the murder charges were ongoing, the convictions for drug and endangerment offenses ensured that the adults involved would face substantial penalties. More importantly, the case prompted a cultural shift in child welfare oversight, legislative action, and public awareness, transforming Maya's tragedy into a force for systemic change. Maya Rudd, born a beacon of innocence and affection, had her life tragically cut short by a combination of parental negligence, criminal activity, and systemic failures. Yet her story did not end with her death. Through legal action, legislative reform, and the commitment of her surviving relatives, her life became a catalyst for reform. House Bill 574, or Maya's Law, now serves as a safeguard to prevent similar tragedies from recurring, ensuring that no infant in Kentucky will face the same fate without intervention. The 3 children who survived are now in a stable, nurturing environment. Alexis and John have committed to raising them as their own, filling a void that the system and their biological parents failed to address. While Maya's death can never be undone, her legacy is a reminder that vigilance, accountability, and compassion are essential in protecting the most vulnerable. Her story, heartbreaking as it is, became a turning point. It forced law enforcement, legislators, and the public to confront the consequences of inaction, the dangers of neglect, and the urgent need for systemic reform. Maya's short life, though tragically ended, left an indelible mark on Kentucky's child protection landscape. It reminded everyone that behind every case file, every report, and every legal procedure, there is a life. And sometimes there is a life worth fighting for, no matter the obstacles.